Okay, guys, quick video just to show you what you missed today. We were looking at internment again, and we just went over the issue of internment. So internment was the decision by Brian Faulkner, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, to introduce detention without trial. Okay, detention without trial is what internment means. And this was because he was under pressure to deal with the rising violence from the Provisional IRA. So internment was brought in on the 9th to the 10th of August 1971. And at this stage, the IRA had been operating, the Provisional IRA had been operating for since the start of the year, and we're beginning to shoot soldiers, police officers, and carry out bombings of shops and offices and businesses and things like that. So he was under big pressure. So he opts for internment without trial because internment without trial had worked in the past. It had worked during the IRA's border campaign of the 1950s and sort of shut it down. So the plan was to use the army to arrest suspects, okay? The army gave the operation the codename Operation Demetrius. And on the 9th and 10th of August, they detained 452 people. But importantly, only nationalists were detained, okay? And this caused great outrage in nationalist communities. There was lots of violence during the operation as the army went in to arrest young men, many of them innocent. 22 people died during the operation, including 11 people who were shot dead by the parachute regiment during an event called the Bala Massacre. And we talked about this in class, the Bala Massacre, and the fact that the revulsion that the community felt because of the death of a priest, for example, during that event. Okay, so what impact did the introduction of internment by Brian Faulkner have? Well, crucially, the introduction of internment failed to stop the violence. Violence in the months after the introduction of internment was 4 times worse than it had been before internment. So somewhere in the region of 30 people had died in the first 8 months of 1971, and then in the final 4 months 130 or 140 people died. So there was a huge upsurge in violence as a result of internment, and it led to a further alienation of the Catholic community because they felt that they were being picked upon basically by the Stormont government. And this word alienated is a good word to use. Think of the word alien. Okay, an alien is somebody who doesn't belong, and Catholics felt that they didn't belong, that their government was picking on them. So what was the reactions? We said that these events, we always need to think about Unionist and Nationalist reactions to these events. We'll take the Nationalist reaction first of all. Well, the SDLP organised a rent and rate strike against internment, okay? There was increased support for the Provisional IRA. And there were anti-internment marches. One of those marches, of course, was the Bloody Sunday March, which we'll look at in another revision video. So there was a huge upsurge of resentment from the nationalist community. We saw images the last day in class 2 of women banging bin lids on the street to warn the young men of the army coming into the area and things like that. So it aroused a lot of sympathy in the Catholic community for the IRA, and it also aroused a lot of hatred for the army and for the Unionist government. On the Unionist side, well, Unionists supported internment because they wanted their government to get a handle on the Provisional IRA and stop the violence. But they felt the government had made a mess of it because the violence didn't decrease. The reasons why internment was such a failure was the army were working on outdated information. Lots of the people that they were arresting weren't actually members of the Provisional IRA. They were people who'd been involved with the IRA in the past, in the 50s, in the 1950s, and therefore they weren't involved now. We also see the development of the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, is set up in September 1971, and as a direct result of internment, and the violence that was increasing as a result of internment, because loyalists felt that things were getting out of hand, that they needed to protect themselves. So some key things to remember about the UDA is that it was a huge organisation. It had 30,000 members. It remained legal throughout the Troubles, so it was never banned, possibly because it was so big. However, it did have a paramilitary wing called the UFF, which was made illegal, and this is the name that the UDA used when they carried out sectarian murders. So that is internment in a nutshell, guys. The key thing to remember about it is that Brian Faulkner introduces it in an attempt to deal with the rise of provisional IRA violence. However, the impact of it is that it creates more violence. It is a complete failure.